I have become a fake creature of slime and desire, and welcome back to Devlog. In the last part I worked on turning and skidding, and in this part I'm working on slope movements, slope building speed, losing speed, and sliding up and down slopes. The first thing I did is work on the slopes logic. I've addressed this in an earlier devlog, so I will go over it very quickly, but essentially the player has sets of information classes for each slope angle. So slope angles are separated into categories: 0 to 25, 25 to 45, 45 to 55, etc, etc, up until 180. This is information for how the player will handle on certain slopes. This has information for how much they will accelerate on these slopes, decelerate, add to their speed, and subtract from their speed, and how much speed they would need to run on such a slope. All these are basically just input values that I am using later in scripting, but for now just keep in track that these values are being used depending on what slope we have. The way that we detect what slope we are on is just by checking the rotational value of the floor, so the floor's normal direction relative to vector 2 up, which is the upward direction of the world, so different floor angles will be different amounts. We will then check if we are running up or down a slope. This will be used later in scripting for if we are building or losing speed. This is very easy, we just check if the direction of movement is going up the slope or going down the slope. So for building and losing speed on the slope, this is very simple. I have my artificial speed values that is input into my scripting to move the player. So this is our current speed and our current momentum. As the player runs up a slope, we will find what the speed loss values are for this slope. So we have a speed loss for the beginning of the slope and a speed loss for the end of a slope. So if a slope is between 45 degrees and 65 degrees for its angle logic on the player's class system, we just detect what angle the player is currently on in between these two angles, and we will lerp our speed setting based on what the least amount of speed from this angle would be and the most amount of speed from our angle would be. So if 45 degrees was -5 speed and 65 degrees was -7 speed, at 55 degrees it would be -6 speed. I had to do basic math in my head as I was talking. That was real tricky. We will then feed this value into our movement scripting for how much we lerp our speed, so we'll have this as a reduction amount or an addition amount to our speed in opposed to our regular speed amount. So this will just increase or decrease our speed based on our acceleration of this slope. If the player is already building speed, this could be overridden because if the player is moving fast enough, they will be building speed more than they are losing speed, so this value is only having a minor influence on the player's movements. But basically it's just a very simple mathematic equation. It's not especially difficult, it's just adding or subtracting to our speed based on the values of each slope. The only interesting part about this is that at some speed values this will be ignored. So for example, if the player is already moving faster than they already would by gaining speed down a slope, they won't have any additional speed added to their system. So if the maximum value for a speed running down a slope of 45 degrees was 20 and our speed was 22, we won't have any additional speed, so the player cannot continue to infinitely build speed by going down the same slopes. The same is true for running up slopes. Our speed will only be lessened by a certain amount if we are moving, and if we are moving fast enough, our speed isn't lessened at all. Because the idea for the game is that the player is continuing to move, they should be able to run up walls or on ceilings. It's just more fun for gameplay, so I don't want to have the player's speed limited too much if they want to continue to run up a wall. If you want to run up the side of a building, you can do that, so long as you continue to move. We then have logic for sliding up and down the slopes. This was originally a movement setup where I had the player add or subtract speed as they were moving up and down the slopes, but I felt like it was more reliable used as a substate system. Hooray for substate systems, the saving grace of all my designs. So the way this works is if you are on a slope moving forward and you press down, if the slope is at a certain amount, you will start sliding down the slope. Going forward, this is a controlled slide. The player can control their speed, and ultimately they are going to be building a lot of speed as they are sliding down the slope going forward. The slope sliding down going forward substate, so this is if we are sliding down a slope forward, will end as soon as the player's current speed is less than the speed required to slide down a slope going forward, or they are not holding an input and they reach a speed of 0. So if we slide down a slope and the slope ends and we aren't holding our input anymore, we will stop moving, or if we are still holding our input, we will continue our momentum, but we will come to a stop of our slide once we have finished going forward at an amount that will build our speed more than just running normally. So if we slide down a slope and then slide up a slope, continuing our momentum, we will just transition into running normally because we're still holding our inputs, and we want to move faster, so we'll just run up the hill as normal. However, we can also be putting these substates without any player control. For example, if the player lands on a slope and they are facing backwards down the slope and their speed is low, they will be losing speed, and then we're putting the player into the sliding backward state so they are slid down the slope manually according to the substate system. This is basically just a setup for the player not being able to stand on a steep slope. If the player is stood on a steep slope or they land on a steep slope and stop moving, they will just be pushed backwards in the sliding backward state. The same as if the player is facing forward on a steep slope, they will automatically be pushed into the sliding forward state and gently pushed down the slope based on the substate system's functionality. Since the game doesn't have any physics, this is my way of having the player actually slide down slopes. It's just substate systems that move players down the slopes. But how does these substates work, you may ask? The way these substate systems work is by feeding the value from our slope systems, where the player will build or lose speed based on what the slopes information is from earlier. We will then find what the player's logic is for each slope system. So these slope substate systems, if we're moving forward, we'll have different values. If we're moving backwards, we have different values. But these values are essentially how much we will gain speed based on these slope multipliers. So for example, when sliding forwards down a slope, we will gain 2 times speed instead of just 1 time speed from this slope movement. So sliding down a slope is faster than just running down a slope normally. And if we are sliding backwards down a slope, we will gain speed negatively, so it pushes our character backwards. Then once we're on stable ground again, each sliding system has its own value for if the player will stop on stable ground. If we're sliding forwards and we are not holding an input, we will stop on stable ground. But if we are holding an input and still want to move, we will just move like normal on stable ground and then revert to regular running movement if our speed is decreased to a certain amount. If we are sliding backwards, we will just make the character stop when on stable ground, and then revert back to our normal movement functionality. Sliding backwards is really only a system that will happen if the player is stopping on slopes, or if they have landed on a slope and don't have enough speed so need to slide down it. It's more of a system that has lack of player control, so that's why there isn't too much movement optionals with sliding backwards. But if we are sliding forwards, there's more options for how to control your player. You can still build speed and turn when sliding forwards. It's a lot more versatile, while sliding backwards is a sucky bad option that you should never do if you're a good gamer. If you see the sliding back functionality while playing my game, that means you're not cool. Finally, we have the animations. These are pretty good. I like them. Even though I am in the current process of reanimating everything to work with a different character style, cough cough, I'm actually drawing the character in 2D this time, cough cough. I am still going to show off these animations because I think they're pretty fun. They're basically just poses animations, which means the character is lerping between these poses based on their velocity. This adds a lot more weight and fluidity to the character's movements based on how fast they're going, because if they're going very fast, I can just have the character have a certain pose, or very slow and they can have the character have a certain pose. It's also significantly easier to animate for. When the character is sliding forward, they pull their pan off their back, which is currently the only reason why they have a pan on their back, and I regret that as a design choice now because it's kind of pointless. But the character pulls the pan off their back and they surf on it, which I think is pretty funny, but it doesn't really read very well for very fast sliding animations because it's slow to pull out the pan, so I may change that in the future, and when stopping, the character just reverses this animation and puts the pan back on her back. When sliding backwards, these are just different poses of skidding and squishing down really far, eventually stumbling backwards as we're going very fast, and landing on their bottom and sliding back even further. These animations are really fun. I like them a lot. There's a lot of squish in these poses, despite being just poses. I think they read very well as what is happening in-game as you are moving, and overall it's just a very fun little visual that has your character sliding. I like it a whole lot. What do you think? Leave a comment below. And that is it for this devlog. I think the sliding functionality is a great addition to the game. I think even if it's not a huge mobility use or it doesn't have a lot of usage in a regular player set, it has a lot of use in pushing the player or making the player do specific actions on different slopes. I think in the future when I add things like slidey surfaces or maybe wet, watery surfaces that the player is automatically going to slide down, the sliding functionality will have a lot more usage because it will be automatically applied in certain situations. For example, if the player was to land on an icy surface that it was angled, they would automatically be forced into sliding, and that could have some gameplay design, fun, maybe, shrug, who's to say? But I think this addition is pretty good for gameplay and complexity of the controller. What do you think of the new Yu-Gi-Oh! Archetype B-Troopers? Personally, I'm a big fan of the insect archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh! I've always felt like they were a bit underutilized, but I am a little freak girl who likes insects a bit too much, so maybe I just have a huge bias, but I'm excited to try them out now. I got one of the fusion monsters in a pack a couple weeks ago. It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool looking, and I think it would have a fun deck archetype surround. And thanks for watching.